from the Mercy One studio.
Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you live from these United States of America here in Des Moines, Iowa, where we both work for Mercy College of Health Sciences. I'm the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director of the Center for Human Flourishing. Bud, what do you do at the old college?
I am the Academic Dean at Mercy College of Health Sciences.
And so we are glad to be able to be with you today. Mercy College of Health Sciences underwriting our show, as always, mchs.edu. Bud, you know, the last time you were here, worked for the Mercy, you got on all sorts of billboards and stuff like that. So when's the next Bud Marr billboard campaign?
I'm kind of worried that I might have aged out because I haven't had... During my first few months at Mercy, back at Mercy, I haven't had anyone approach me from marketing about billboard opportunities.
Well, I got on a billboard once. Not a billboard. I got a picture taken of me and have never been asked back. So I wouldn't read too much into it.
I think yours is pretty cool because you're like in the chapel dropping truth bombs on students, really engaging some students in the beautiful chapel there at Mercy College. I forget what mine was, but... We've talked about this before, that, you know, one thing about having a radio station in Des Moines is you can be kind of surprised when someone says, like, I recognize your voice. But I didn't know exactly when that campaign was going to roll out. And I think the initial stage was signs inside of buses on Iowa's campus. So I would have, you know, the strangest encounters in grocery stores and things where people were like, they were trying to place my face.
I think it was because you were willing to wear, not willing, you sort of had purple shirts. And so they were like, this is going to work out wonderfully. You know, what's funny is even with masks on, which of course, you know, since they hear your voice, it doesn't matter as much. Someone was like, oh, don't you have that show? But I've been called Bud a few times, but clearly they meant Bo, because I was going to feel bad if they thought, you know, you had this body walking around. That was going to be sad for you.
No, it's all good. And we do make it confusing for people because, you know, both work at Mercy College. Bo and Bud, like short names that start with B, you know, the Beards, similar degrees. So I don't blame people for the occasional mix-up.
That's right. I just, you know, people come up and will talk to you about, like, really deep, heartfelt things. And if they're expecting, you know, your appreciative patience, they might just be missing out because I might not be able to control making a good joke.
You're being hard on yourself there, Bo. I know, like, in circles of friends, I think one of your gifts is being a prophetic truth teller. But at Mercy College, I don't know, I feel like you have a really diverse range of friendships and professional connections, so you've navigated that well.
That's right. One of the fun things that Bud and I have is getting a chance to go and talk to people we knew in grad school who haven't talked to us for a while, and I think they're always constantly like, oh, Bo, you're employed. That's nice.
Yeah.
I can't believe that happened.
No, I feel like, honestly, they will save this for another show, but when you talk about, like, potentially stepping on toes, I'm maybe more prone to that, like, in the classroom, or I have a distinct time in mind where I had to give a presentation at school, and it was fine, but I ruffled a few feathers.
I think it's funny that it's how the world works out is because people expect you to hear them out, which you do. You're a very good listener. But so I think when people go, oh, well, Bud's a good listener, so I think in their mind they're like, which means that Bud completely agrees with me. And then you gently tell them that you don't, and it, like, wounds them very much. Whereas if I'm all like, I blah, 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 they're like, oh, that's Bo. That's
I'm just reading passages from the Bible, and they're like, he's throwing flames.
Bud's new nickname is the Flamethrower.
I'll take it.
That would be nice. Well, I don't know how to transition away from flamethrower, especially since I'm happy that I said it correctly. I usually mess that up. But like we said, you can go to mchs.edu, and Mercy College underwrites our show and see all the different. We're kind of getting into midterms with March rolling around, thinking about things like commencement in April and summer and all these things like this. But summer and fall we're gearing up to do. We have initiatives that are coming up that hopefully people can get to take advantage of. mchs.edu.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about education today that everyone's certainly worried about is the financial burden that comes with it. And I just want to say, you head to the website there. There's all sorts of opportunities and ways to make things work.
Yeah, I think they just
MCHS.edu.
announced that you can send in, why can I not think of the word? Applications, scholarship applications. So you'll be good. You'll all feel good that no one asks me to read applications and make decisions on scholarships. So,
well, Bo, what do we have on the show today? On tap today?
Today we're taking applications on it. No, I'm kidding. Today we're talking about two words I think that often get misconstrued and that actually I think fall into our wheelhouse that maybe there might be, I don't know if disagreement's the right word, but certainly different takes on stuff. But conscience and obedience and how that relates to the common good. And when it comes to the idea of conscience, I think I'm more familiar, I'd say, with Thomas Aquinas and his take on it. You certainly, as a Newman scholar, have a lot to say on conscience. I'm not trying to say that they're directly opposed, but I do think that there are very different takes on a topic that, of course, for all sorts of reasons, is perpetually in people's mind. I think in the last year, questions about mass vaccines, it's obvious why it gets continued to be talked about, but hopefully we can shed some light about how both what we mean when we talk about conscience and obedience, but how that has to do with more than just individuals.
Yeah, as a show that deals with Catholic social teaching, we, of course, try to keep our fingers on the pulse of things, and, often the show revolves around current events, but today's episode is one of those where I think it's foundational. Like, you have to get this sort of thing right if you're going to address the things that are coming at you on a day-to-day basis. So this is one of those sort of like first principle shows, which maybe sounds a little boring on the surface, but we promise you it won't be this morning.
No, and especially with how popular, and rightly so, the teaching of John Henry Newman has been. It's interesting to think, right, like a year later. I mean, you were in Rome not too long ago at some point?
So it was October of 2019.
There you go.
15, 16 months ago.
So we're still, on that high of him being a saint and talking about what that means. And so hopefully the sort of, again, not necessarily contrast or opposition, but the two flavors will help people see how they might be able to apply that. And application is very central in this topic for things that are going on today. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around, and we'll be talking about this right after these messages. Folks, if you have questions for us, it's easy to ask them. Just use the Zip Whip line. 515-223-1150, 515-223-1150, your connection to Iowa Catholic Radio, hashtag UCG for the uncommon good, the Zip Whip line. 515-223-1150, 515-223-1150. Jimmy, it's always nice to come in the week after Carathon and see all the Zip Whip line used as it is, and but we'd love to hear from you. 515-223-1150, the Zip Whip line, for any questions that you might have, any comments. I don't know if you want to throw out actual specific questions of conscience, but you know what? Bud and I are here, and we just talked about how good of a listener Bud is and that he's a flamethrower, so do it. It's fine. The Zip Whip line. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back after this.
Thank you, Big Red Q Quick Print, for underwriting the sports report. Family owned and operated since 1980. Big Red Q Quick Print is a full-service print shop ready to help you with all your printing needs with speed and accuracy. Forms, manuals, brochures, letterhead, envelopes, business cards, custom invitations, design, and bindery. Big Red Q Quick Print, located across from Merle Hay Mall. Online at bigredq-desmoines.com. Big Red Q Quick Print. We make printing easy.
Thank you, Farm Bureau agent Cindy Schulte, for underwriting Catholic Women Now. As an authorized independent agent, Cindy's team can provide health insurance options from Wellmark Blue Cross Blue Shield of Iowa. Cindy Schulte at 1315 50th Street in West Des Moines, or on the web at cindyschulte.com. 515-226-2111. Cindy and her team know health insurance.
Wellmark Blue Cross Blue Shield of Iowa is an independent licensee of the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association. Products available at Farm Bureau Financial Services.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Storm Alert Weather is provided by Divine Treasures. Divine Treasures is a Catholic book and gift store serving the Des Moines community for over 25 years. Their mission is to help Catholics know, love, and keep their faith in our Lord Jesus Christ and His Church. Divine Treasures is where you can find great Catholic books, beautiful Bibles, rosaries, jewelry, statues, and religious gifts for those memorable events in your life. Divine Treasures, 5701 Hickman Road, Des Moines. 515-255-5230. Thank you to Divine Treasures for their support of Iowa Catholic Radio.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Catholic Women Now provided in part by Marr Security, providing security solutions for homes and businesses since 1953. Marr Security is a Catholic-owned family business supplying security systems, access control systems, video surveillance, fire alarm systems, and video doorbells. All alarm systems are monitored out of their monitoring center located in the state of Iowa. Marr Security, 515-244-5660, permarsecurity.com.
Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the show. We want to say hello to anybody who might be listening live on the internet, www.iowacatholicradio.com, because our good friend Tim O'Malley just found it in his heart to start talking about how everybody should listen to us right before the show. That was nice.
Oh, I haven't seen this yet.
Yeah, it's on Twitter. He was just like out of the blue. We all you all would have a good time listening to it. So I think he wants to get back on the show, which is fair. But yeah, that was very nice to hear from him.
That's a Notre Dame endorsement, so that's golden.
That's right. That's a guy with the most stylish glasses that I know endorsement.
Real quick, before we get to the heavy stuff, when I came in today, there was a snack table left over from Carathon, and they had pistachios. That's a real weak spot for me. But if I start choking on these, I'm in trouble, because Jimmy said pistachios is a bad on-air snack.
Pistachios particularly. Well, yeah, I made the mistake of, you ever get that chance where you're like, oh, I'm going to give my kids something I like pistachios, and maybe they'll like it, and half the time they never do, and then they all like it, and you're like, this is great, and then you're like, oh, right, it's like the most expensive nut to buy, and that's why they all... Of course, they love it. That's what happened to me.
I think my kids have a very similar palate. That's part of my genetics that they've inherited. Although, like, spiciness is a big deal in my family, and it's like anything is spicy. So if something kind of has like hits you hard flavor wise, it's like that's spicy. And I try to tell the boys especially, like, that's not quite the precise term. Like,
right,
this chili is spicy, but what? Wasabi, I guess you could say, is spicy.
Oh, well, Finian, famously said he thought peppermints were spicy, yeah. and I almost gave up the ghost that I was going to have a child ostensibly genetically Oklahoman who thought peppermints were spicy. It really hurt, and I blamed his Kansan mom on that one.
Well, when I get home, I'll ask them if they thought this episode was spicy.
Nothing as spicy as conscience. Yeah. So, oh, this is great. So, conscience and obedience. We have our good friend, speaking of spices, pumpkin spices, John Leonetti, who always likes his spiced coffees. He had me talk about obedience on his earlier show this morning. And like our group is wont to do, one of the nice things about modern friendship, I know that we always bemoan the modern world, but one thing that's nice is your friends can immediately say, you forgot to talk about blank. Yeah. And so shout out to Mark, who pointed out, if you're going to talk about obedience, why wouldn't you talk about conscience? And I think it's a great question to ask. I was being a Thomistic philosopher dork and was like, well, they're two different things.
Yeah.
But of course, in the modern discourse, they're very much entwined. And so I think that it was absolutely right to ask that. And then we had an open show today. So we switched things around and we're going to talk about conscience and obedience.
Yeah, this is a controversial topic, I think. I don't know how to say this politely necessarily, but Bo,
flamethrower Bud.
I know. And I guess really to kick us off, over the last half century in Catholicism, I think especially in the Western world, a lot of the faithful have wrestled with these questions of obedience and conscience because, the church in many cases has very strong language about certain actions being objectively sinful or gravely sinful. And I know, like in America, that many American Catholics have parted ways on specific questions. And I guess we could start off by saying, what's a wrong understanding of conscience? And for me, this would start with, you hear the language sometimes among, I think especially academic theologians, about the primacy of conscience,
right?
Which is interpreted as well, the church says this one thing, and that's fine and dandy, but at the end of the day, what matters is your conscience and following that. Now, as a Newman scholar, I feel compelled, and I can save this for a little bit later, but to address this because he does use similar language, but uses it, I want to argue, in a slightly different way. Before we get to that, though, I think we want to reach back further. You threw out at the start of the show Thomas Aquinas, and really even for Newman, Aquinas is always in the background when he talks about these topics.
Yeah, and I think on that note it's important to point out, because you're right, like we will get language that talks about the being bound by conscience, and it's absolutely true that Thomas Aquinas will say things as shocking, I think, to some, to say that even an erring conscience is binding, which means a conscience that is in error is binding. But the reason for that is very important, why he thinks that's the case, because what that might sound like when you sort of throw that into the mix of how we think, for instance, free will works, or how our intelligence works, that makes it sound like, hey, you might be wrong, but it's always Jiminy Cricket sort of stuff. Always let your conscience be your guide. Be true to yourself. And what's the Shakespeare quote that they always misquote? It's like, "Tune thine own self, be true," but that was actually the villain saying that. That to me is very paradigmatic about how we misunderstand some of these pronouncements about conscience.
Yeah, Newman makes a similar point, because he does want to dispel the Jiminy Cricket idea, although that's, let's see, is that after his time? Pinocchio.
Yes, there was not moving pictures, but do we need to start talking about if you're fully recovered from stuff? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the cartoon is based on a novel.
That's right. That's okay. Good point. I don't know if Jiminy Cricket predates the movie.
Needless to say, Jiminy Cricket's never explicitly comes up in Newman's text, but
you've heard it here, folks.
He does. Well, Newman comes right out and says, I talk a lot about conscience, and I know that to be the case, but he says, in our own day, there's this false understanding that's arisen, and he says the false understanding is primacy of self-will. Mm-hmm. So this would be a kind of subjectivism where what is right and wrong is sort of according to the dictates of my own mind. For Newman, and Bo, you can supplement this with Thomas, conscience is another one of the universal human faculties. So we have, I mean, I'm not great at anthropology, but we have our emotions, we have our rational faculties, and for Newman, we have conscience, which, unless there's some sort of defect in a human being, either by virtue of like some form of like disability, or we talk about sociopaths. A sociopath is someone who has basically ignored their conscience for so long that it's no longer operating. But otherwise, it's a universal human experience that we have a conscience. And Newman says what's interesting about conscience is that it has this dual quality. It not only allows us to perceive moral laws, but also when we act against it, we feel shame. And he says that's interesting, because normally when we feel shame, we feel it in relation to another person. So say we disobey our parents or we let down our parents, we have that quality of shame. And so Newman thinks that conscience is one of the ways, like a natural faculty, that points us to our relation to God. We feel that we've either, like when we act in accord with it, we feel this kind of relief. When we act against it, we feel shame. And so it's a way for him, actually, it's a proof of God's existence for him, which is probably an interesting topic for another day. But all this to say, Bo, it's not self-will for Newman. There's a professor that you and I both had, Reinhard Hutter, who teaches at the Catholic University of America, and he says for Newman, and he's a Thomist, and for Thomas, I haven't validated this per se, but for them, conscience is always theocentric, that if you don't understand what they're saying about conscience in relation to the divine law, you've misunderstood what they said. So, I mean, in short, for Newman, conscience is actually reinforcing of revelation. Both are means by which God communicates to us moral laws that bind us.
Yeah, so for Thomas, this starts to be, to unpack a few things. Part of this is about how you end up naming things. Mm-hmm. And for scholastics like Thomas, conscience actually has a very specific meaning, and then he himself will admit that other things that he thinks aren't properly conscious get named that. But suffice it to say, so just to be practical first, when we point out that people come to different conclusions because of their conscience, it's not because everybody has their own Jiminy Cricket. I almost said Jiminy Glick. That's a whole other thing. They don't have their own individual Jiminy Cricket that might be telling them different things. Your conscience, would maybe become something different, because conscience has everything to do with taking first principles of morality and applying them to a particular case. So the reason that we might have variable outcomes of conscience is because our circumstances are different. And as, this goes back to Aristotle, we can get into like very big, minute details of ethics, but suffice it to say, there's nothing like the modern idea that you kind of have duties that you know in your mind, and then it's just a matter of like whether you do them or not. And I guess that's important to say too. Conscience actually is not about the will. The will comes after. So even after conscience dictates whatever we might talk about, it's still within your power to will or not to will according to your conscience. I think sometimes we hear conscience and let your conscience be your guide, and it turns into gut feeling versus reason. And gut feeling is something like your will just by sheer power choosing something. But conscience, according to Thomas, is not even really a power or a faculty specifically. He'll get into what I'll talk about that means. He says it's an act. Conscience is, first of all, an act. What it has to do with knowledge applied to an individual case. So the application of knowledge to something is done by some act. Wherefore, from this explanation, the name is clear that conscience is an act. Now, he says there's this other part that gets called conscience, synderesis, which is and I'm probably saying it wrong, but synderesis is often called conscience, and this is the natural power of judgment, or what he says the first habit of the mind towards morals. So the habit, the natural habit, the first principles, the law of the intellect. So we usually call both things conscience, and I think that's what Newman means more than anything else. But for Thomas, it's important to point out that when we talk about our conscience, what our conscience is doing is taking what we know through natural law, which means irrevocable first principles and axioms of morality. But then we have to have an act that takes those first principles and applies them to how we would do them in the face of whatever events we're actually facing. And conscience is that ability, that act of the intellect to say, this is how I'm going to live out as best possible this moral first principle in life right now. And then it's left to my will to either do that or not. And our will can fail because of weakness, it can fail because of concupiscence, it can just be rebellious, etc. But you start to see that for Thomas, when we go something like, oh, I have to follow my conscience, he almost means something like you don't really have a choice. Like it's almost this is something that kind of has to happen unless you are rebellious against yourself. Like you're too afraid to do what you think you're feeling. Whereas a lot of people, like I said, conscience is like a gut intuition that is somehow smarter than your discursive reason.
Yeah, I think that language that you pointed to there about habit is so significant. Because if someone acts against the moral law repeatedly, their ability to discern what's right and wrong is going to be weakened. It's just like our muscles atrophying. How do you say that?
Yeah, atrophy.
Yeah, but in a verb form. Like
atrophied? Atrophying.
Yeah, that's what I tried to say.
Atrophying.
So,
sure.
So when you think about...
Our spelling and pronunciation muscles have atrophied, yeah.
Atrophied. So when you think about this, if a person over time is repeatedly acting against what's objectively right and wrong, their conscience is going to be weakened. And I think that's an idea that's not brought so much into play in a lot of contemporary discourse. This idea that our consciences could be poorly formed. And I think the only way to get back to that is, like you said, to sort of like clear the playing field and have a right understanding of conscience. You know, Newman uses this really interesting phrase to me where he calls conscience the aboriginal vicar of Christ. Now, that's kind of a mouthful, but what he's saying is that the aboriginal vicar of Christ, so Christ he possesses all authority under heaven and earth, and, you know, all that Christ willed was in accord with the Father's will. If you talk about the aboriginal vicar of Christ, stepping back, the church, and particularly the office of St. Peter the Pope, is Christ's vicar, so Christ's representative after his ascension. If conscience is the aboriginal vicar, it's the same voice of God reaching us, but it's reaching us aboriginally or originally. So Newman wants to say that you have a child of 5 who maybe has not been taught much at all of the moral law, but they still have a perception of what's right and wrong. And when they listen to that, they're hearing the same voice that you might receive through revealed truths. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, for Newman, these things are always consonant. He doesn't want to have this bifurcation between the moral law and what we're hearing in conscience. He wants to say properly perceived, that they're self-reinforcing, and properly followed, they'll lead you to the same conclusions.
Right. So you think about this in terms of the intellect straight up. So what are the first principles of intellection? So you talk about the principle of non-contradiction. So no kid, like this 5-year-old, is going to be able to tell you, like, A cannot be not A in the same time, in the same place, in the same manner. However, even kids grasp that sort of idea in an intuitive way, because, unless they're being fanciful or telling jokes or something, they're not going to say something like, I ate food and didn't eat food. Or if they do that, they'll realize it's silly talk and they'll laugh. But there's this idea, right, that these things that are true to the intellect, the only way you cannot believe them is to be consistently told opposite, right? Only schooling can make you disbelieve in the principle of non-contradiction. However, if you have a good school and it continually tells you this fact, the principle of non-contradiction, and they reinforce it through demonstration, now what is aboriginal, as it were, to your intellect becomes reinforced and can be very stable. The same thing happens in morality with first principles. People go, if natural law is real, why are there some cultures that believe it's okay to lie to your enemies? And you go, well, yeah, they teach their kids that. Yeah. And they'll go like, oh, well, my kid doesn't naturally know not to lie. And you're like, it's true, but your kids also develop a sense, right, that do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. It is only sort of through perversion of seeing alternate examples that they would go against this. And so conscience is the ability to see these first principles as they exist and then try to apply them when you see the situation come up. And just because something is there by nature doesn't mean that it can't be greatly deformed and that it can't be deformed with ease. This is why it's important to have things like culturally reinforced devotion to morals, not so much norms or even politeness, although that probably plays into it as well, but that the important thing is to say kids have a sense to not be wicked to each other, but if they see that enforced the opposite way, they will quickly do away with making those acts of conscience. They'll do the opposite because of what's been reinforced, even if it's an erring conscience.
Yeah, so I think, Bo, getting near the break here, one thing we've been trying to highlight is conscience can't be used as simply an out or a trump card to go against like a duly constituted authority. That primacy of conscience, it might sound like you and I are like dismissing that in some way, but we're actually not. And I think you were hinting at this earlier, but I'll say what Newman comes out and says clearly about it. For him, when you talk about the primacy of conscience, and that just simply means that we always have to act in accord with conscience, if Catholics were to dismiss that idea, the moral life would become completely unintelligible. So we have to say there's primacy of conscience because there are instances where a duly constituted authority could ask you to do something wrong. So if a governing official asks you to trample on an image of Christ, you could say in conscience, I can't follow that, not because I don't respect your authority, but because it would be an offense to God. On the other hand, like if a person thinks something is wrong and does it anyway, they've made, like I said, the moral life unintelligible. Like to consistently act against conscience would make it impossible altogether to know what's right and wrong. But we have to follow up that idea by saying, just because that happens to be the case, doesn't mean their act of conscience was valid. Like right. a person could make a wrong judgment in that particular matter. It would still be wrong for them to act against their conscience. Like you can't say like, I know this to be wrong, but I'm going to do it anyways. But that doesn't automatically mean that your judgment in that case was correct.
Absolutely. Primacy of conscience is almost to say that it's a central matter that we must deal with. And when we get back from the break, we'll attach this to the idea of obedience.
Yeah.
And I think when you talk about those two things together, you start to talk about the importance of all this for the common good itself. This is The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr, and we'll be back right after this. Folks, if you want to keep up with Iowa Catholic Radio, it's easy to do. All you have to do is go to iowacatholicradio.com, where you can listen live, donate, sign up to get emails so you know what's going on, even see pictures of people that I guess you can see if you would like. You can also go to facebook.com, Iowa Catholic Radio, and befriend us, and then you will have all of the great, wonderful, royal benefits of Facebook friendship with us, which mostly involves hitting reply. Also, you can go to Twitter at IA Catholic Radio, follow our tweets, and then we will be mutual tweetdom together. I don't know what that means. Also, finally, you can download the Iowa Catholic Radio app, and anywhere you have data, you can listen live, donate, and do all sorts of other wonderful things as well. This is The Uncommon Good, and we will be back right after this.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and John Leonetti in the Morning is provided by Blessman International. Blessman International partners with volunteers and donors to provide sustainable programs for children in South Africa by leading a 12-day, all-inclusive experience sharing the heart of Christ with vulnerable children in South Africa. Teams are forming to do something significant in an African child's life. Learn more at blessmaninternational.org. That's blessmaninternational.org. Thank you, Blessman International, for your support of Iowa Catholic Radio.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Christ is the Answer with Father John Ricardo is provided by Confluence Brewing Company, brewed locally and featuring regular, seasonal, and limited release beers available at local stores, bars, and restaurants. Confluence Brewing Company at 1235 Thomas Beck Road, off the bike trail south of Grays Lake, and online at confluencebrewing.com. Confluence Brewing Company offers curbside service and would like to thank you for your support. Thank you, Confluence Brewing Company, for your support of Iowa Catholic Radio.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Storm Alert Weather is provided by Divine Treasures. Divine Treasures is a Catholic book and gift store serving the Des Moines community for over 25 years. Their mission is to help Catholics know, love, and keep their faith in our Lord Jesus Christ and His Church. Divine Treasures is where you can find great Catholic books, beautiful Bibles, rosaries, jewelry, statues, and religious gifts for those memorable events in your life. Divine Treasures, 5701 Hickman Road, Des Moines, 515-255-5230. Thank you to Divine Treasures for their support of Iowa Catholic Radio.
Here's your forecast on Iowa Catholic Radio. High pressure is set up over the Central Plains and also the Midwestern states, and that'll keep things fair for our area with pretty mild temperatures. We'll hit about 58 for the high this afternoon with sunshine. Overnight down to about 30 and a few clouds, and then tomorrow we'll get sunny skies and our afternoon high will be in the low 50s. For Thursday night, partly cloudy and then 50s for the weekend and fair. I'm meteorologist Steve Hamilton on Iowa Catholic Radio.
Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this Wednesday. Thank you for being a part of the show. We were just having, light, fun, jokey talks about conscience, right? Just the easy stuff, Bud.
That's right.
No, we were talking about conscience. I think important distinctions to be made because I know matters of conscience get brought up, like you have pointed out, the last 50 to 100 years, but particularly in the last year. And it makes sense that they are. Hopefully dispelled some ideas about what we misunderstand about conscience. It is definitely not the Jiminy Cricket understanding of conscience. It's not gut feeling. It is actually sophisticated, but we got to the point about that the primacy of conscience only really makes sense if we sort of immediately are willing to take the bigger picture about it. This is not just a matter of the individual always ends up being right. Indeed, it's the case that you can be bound to your conscience, but your conscience is in error, and that you actually do something that is wrong, and you might not be blamable, what am I trying to say? Culpable for saying yes to your erring conscience, but you might be culpable for letting your conscience fall into error, which is an important thing. This is why teachers and magisterium and all of this is very important. And Bud, out of the gate, because then I think this will get into our discussion about obedience, my estimation of the whole ordeal is that most people have doubtful consciences that they mistake for erring ones. And so when they have doubtful consciences, this is when they get themselves tied up in loops. Funny enough, I think most people who have erring consciences would never bat an eye. Right? Like, you know, I think when people go like, matter of conscience, Thomas More. No, Thomas More was like sort of up all night wrestling with the best thing to do, right? And I think that's because he had a doubting conscience, which he was like, how am I going to practically follow all of this that I should follow? I usually think the circumstance when people have an erring conscience is usually when people think, I know I must do this, but they're wrong because their conscience is misformed.
Could you share an example of like a doubting conscience? I'm trying to see that distinction there versus erring. Okay,
so a doubting conscience is so like if we go back to what we said in the first part of the show, conscience, at least for the scholastics, is really a two-part thing. There's conscience proper, which is an act, and then there's the syndicresis, or however you say it correctly, which is the first principles of the moral law that are available to us. And so conscience is an act of taking those first principles and applying them to a case, a particular case.
Yeah.
And so, of course, there's all sorts of times where we might, because of the particular case, not know what we should do particularly to enact a first principle of the moral law. So if you're thinking about times where one of the first principles of the moral law is the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And so then you get into this doubtful fate, because you're like, okay, do I really want to like correct a brother in Christ? Would I want to be corrected? And there's a way in which you go, no, I would rather them leave me alone. But then you go, no, actually, I would rather them correct me. And then you go, am I trying to, but am I like trying to act like I'm this person's judge? Am I trying to act better than them? A doubtful conscience, right? Like that's a difficult thing. How do you apply in this particular case the first principle of the moral law, do unto others, so you should have them do unto you? And so that's a doubtful one. And in that case, Thomas Aquinas goes, follow the whatever principle of a superior like the church has given you, or even friends or things like this, because the moment you have a doubtful conscience is your conscience telling you that you don't have the sort of veracity of act to choose what you're actually going to do. But I'm telling you, funny enough, when people have an erring conscience, they almost always are like, absolutely, I need to do this. And it's because their conscience has been malformed.
Yeah. No, that's a good distinction, and I think that will be helpful, hopefully, for many listeners. I haven't thought about it from that angle before, but a doubtful conscience, as you describe it, that's going to come up quite a bit in life.
Right.
But that shouldn't make us doubt the broader principles that we've been talking about.
And maybe that might be a trick of the English. The idea, right, is like an unsure conscience, right? But I think a lot of people have that in mind, is like, oh, my conscience is telling me something different. The scholastics would go, oh, no, actually, your conscience is admitting that it doesn't have the authority or wherewithal to make the decision that you should do. You should go seek someone else to help you out. But it's like you said, I think we look at the sort of big cases where people have taken like magnificent stands, and we go, this is the heart of consciousness. And you're like, no, I mean, in many ways, conscience, when it really matters, is a day-to-day thing about how we get in the habit of making practical what is axiomatic.
Yeah.
First principles into day-to-day decisions about life. And those habits can really make conscience go astray. And I think that that's what, like you've been talking about with Newman, he's really attentive to how those problems end up being that way.
Well, yeah, I think where this can get heated, or so if you were listening to the first segment of the show, all of that, I think most Catholics tuning in will be like, yeah, that makes basic sense to me. And we were dealing mostly at broad principles that I think a lot of folks would agree on. Where this gets a little bit more dicey is when you start getting into the weeds of actual moral questions. And
absolutely.
I can kick off the conversation with the sorts of things Newman was forced to tackle. So let's rewind time back to about 1873. This is
before Jiminy Cricket.
Before Jiminy Cricket.
Yes.
When back to return to normalcy back in 1873. Normalcy.
Right.
This is in the wake of the First Vatican Council, and at that council, the Church promulgated a definition of papal infallibility. It said, in certain instances, when the Pope is addressing the entire church on matters of faith and morals, we can trust that what he says is given without error. We don't have time today to get into the nitty-gritty of all that was involved there, but basically
everyone agreed, right? It was real easy, right? Yeah. Not a big deal at all.
That's another episode. There are instances in the modern time we would point to something like the definition of Our Lady's Assumption, body and soul into heaven, where the Holy Father spoke directly to the entire church, and we can trust that as a truthful word regarding divine revelation. Well, in the wake of this decision, there were folks, especially in England. So, for instance, Prime Minister William Gladstone, he said, with this decision, English Catholics can no longer be trusted, because to place yourself in the Catholic Church is to make your conscience a slave to a foreign despot. And the Pope could ask English Catholics to do things that would be harmful to the common good. And so he said, really, after what the Church has said about papal infallibility, we can't trust Catholics to be good citizens of the state. And Newman was forced to address these questions. This is where he brought conscience into play. I have to distill this down into a very brief summary, but in short, what Newman says is that the Church, yes, it does speak authoritatively and sometimes infallibly on matters of natural law. What he says is that the Church normally gives broad principles to guide our conscience. So, for instance, let's go to something like marriage and family life. So the Church has said, each marriage has to be open to life, and that's a broad principle that the Church has judged on. Newman would say that's absolutely the case, and that's binding on our conscience, but the Church doesn't say necessarily
how many
children each couple has to have.
Right.
The issue that Newman tackled, funny enough, was military service, and he said the Church has given us clear principles regarding what constitutes a just war. Could the Pope ask English Catholics, or could he command them under obedience not to fight in a specific war? Newman judged in that matter, no. The Pope's infallible authority doesn't extend as far to specific questions about a particular war. Now, but we could probably do an episode on that one as well. But you begin to see the sort of distinctions that Newman is making. And Newman says for the Pope to run against conscience and just to say, do what I say, no questions asked, he thinks the Church would be sawing off the limb that it's sitting upon. Because whenever the Pope or any sort of bishop makes a judgment about the moral law and challenges Catholics to follow it, he's actually appealing to conscience. It's conscience that gives the Church's authoritative teaching its traction.
Right. And I think that goes into the next thing that we put in the title of the show with obedience, another word that can actually cause more confusion than it clears up. The idea of obedience, the word itself means to listen, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in its etymology, right? That we listen to the proper people to listen to and then follow suit. Whereas the conscience has to do with the intellectual powers, particularly practical wisdom. Obedience has to do with the will. And so the question is, who are we willing to sacrifice our will to listen to theirs, which, of course, funny enough, is an act of will. We must will to do the will of another. There's not a sort of negative space where I give up my will and do someone else's. That's manipulation or slavery. That's an outside force. When I say I will do the will of another, I am the one who must do that. I must will that to be the case. And for obedience, particularly in Thomas Aquinas, the idea, right, is all tied up with justice. Obedience is about doing the will. It's not even doing the will. It's actually giving my will, as it were, to the person to which my will is owed. And that we do this because of reverence. So obedience is tied to reverence. The obvious case is God. We owe everything to God. We owe reverence to God. We worship God. Therefore, when God asks us to will certain things he wills, we are, through reverence and justice, bound to do so. It's not necessary, right? We have free will. We can disobey that. But willing and obedience, hand in hand, right? So the idea so what gets confusing, right, is obedience and conscience, of course, go together, but that's because conscience is something that should be listened to and obeyed. So we talk about obeying your conscience, so this is where the primacy of conscience starts to come in, is to say your will can choose all sorts of things. It can choose to listen to your tum-tum because it's rumbling for pistachios. There's pistachios on the table. That's the inside joke. Your will can try to do something because it's worried about whether fame and honor will follow with what its activities are. Conscience is just to say that this is the act of your practical reason worth obeying within you. And so then we have to talk about the fact that obedience, of course, we should only do the will of someone that rightfully asks of it in particular situations. So, for instance, your body can only ask you, as it were, to will for things that are for good for the body in a certain circumspect way. Things of the intellect, things of the soul, overcome that, right? Same thing when we're talking about, should I listen to a ruler, and you go, yes, you should do the will of the ruler as long as they're asking you something that duly they have the right to ask, and certainly your conscience, but also God himself, contravene or outweigh the reverence due to a ruler. So conscience and obedience go hand in hand in this sort of way in which we make a complete moral act of ourselves. It involves our intellect, our practical intellect, and then our will. But then it also connects us to the wider body for whom we are giving our will. And that's the last thing to bring up. To me, the most profound way to talk about this is Thomas Aquinas quotes Gregory the Great saying, the reason in the scriptures that obedience is better than sacrifice is because sacrifice, you just immolate the body of an animal to give to God. But obedience is us immolating our will, which is a spiritual reality to God. It's literally a higher sacrifice. And so when we think about obedience and conscience, that starts to be, I think, an interesting way to think about it, but is like, to whom will we sacrifice our wills to, not what choice do I think is best?
Yeah. And for Newman, at the end of the day, with what you all said, what you just said there, he wants to say that the onus for those who say my conscience is in conflict with the church, the onus is always on the individual person. For him, it's sort of unnatural that we would be out of sync with the will of the church. And so, like, if you're living your life over the long term against the dictates of the church, that's sort of like an unnatural state. Mm-hmm. And so Newman just really presses, like, those who read his work here to say, like, if I land in a different place, he wants to let them know how truly serious that really is. Now, Newman says something, Bill, I'd be interested to get your opinion on this one. He thinks that there's actually not instances in which a person's conscience could conflict with the judgments of the church. Like, this is an interesting point because he says, like I said, the church judges on these sort of broad principles. And Newman accepts as sort of a matter of fact, like that's true because of who the church happens to be. Whereas the conscience is always dealing with the here and the now. So it's making judgments in very particular situations. So for him, it's almost like he thinks it would be impossible to throw out the broad principles. Those are sort of like concrete and real and lasting. And the conscience is kind of ruling, like, in specific circumstances, applying those principles.
Yeah, I think that there's two things to say. On one hand, you'd have to ask, well, is it possible for individuals, let alone groups, to truly be, like, tricked, as it were, and go like, no, murdering innocent people is fine. What I would throw out, and maybe this is me being slightly more Augustinian than both Newman and Thomas, is clearly there are people who like society-wide totally think it's cool to do X horrible thing. I don't think that's particularly damaging to anything we're saying, because of course you throw in the devil in a lot of things, like, so the devil presents himself as an angel of light to confuse us, which is why we need a magisterium to help us out. But also that it really is the case that from very early on, you can make children go against every good natural instinct. Like, that's not the right word, but the instances of the natural law that would make them think different. Mm-hmm. To me, where the rubber hits the road, and maybe this is where Newman would still disagree with me, is it's clearly the case that, for instance, bishops make local particular asks of us, and that starts to be like the ordinary magisterium. And it's funny because I think in the sort of public discourse now, we get really like it's an Excel spreadsheet, and we're like, well, this is this sort of magisterium, and this is this magisterium, and you only have to do this for this one. Like, it's very qualitative, and we made it like some weird sort of LARPing video game where it's all like, oh, don't worry about that. That's in a different realm. That your princess is elsewhere sort of deal. But really what I think we start meaning about the difference between an ordinary magisterium and extraordinary and all these things like this goes back to what we're saying. Dogma is declarations of general principles that can't be contravened. But your bishop is your pastor, and to the best of his ability, makes decisions of his conscience that he enacts for us. And it's quite possible to understand where someone's conscience on the ground would go against, as it were, what a bishop says, and then you have to ask about the question of who do you obey, the bishop or your conscience. And you're right, then this is philosophical principles about can you truly disobey your conscience, blah, blah, blah. But to get down to this goes back to my point. I actually think most people in these situations, Bud, have doubtful consciences. Like, they hear what the bishop says, and it just doesn't seem right, but they're not dead sure why, and it's not their fault because they're not trained professional ethicists. And very unpopularly, I will now say, you should follow your bishop. Because unless your conscience is absolutely sure, to me, you will go, there is no way I can do this. If you start giving examples like, well, my bishop isn't competent for this, or, oh, well, like, it was this sort of announcement and not this one, the minute you start kind of like fishing for places to come up with why you shouldn't follow your bishop, I am going to pronounce here that I'm guessing what you have is a doubtful conscience and not an erring one, because the people who are confident about that don't seem to have these issues. But it's still the case. It is true that your bishop can't tell you to do everything. And your bishop, there have been bishops, they ended up being kicked out of the church, that made demands of their clergy, of their people, that was then later, should have been contravened, right? Because it was a matter of obeying God over your specific bishop. But none of this can be taken lightly, and none of this is about gut feelings. All of this would be extremely, at least prayerfully done. But when we start about a matter of conscience, right, it's not a matter of, oh, what sounds right to me? What's my gut feeling?
We have like a minute left, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm tempted to broach another topic, but I probably can't do it justice. I'll give you all an assignment for those who are listening. If you want to go track down A Man for All Seasons about the life of St. Thomas More, there's a point that I want to make, but I think the film actually would make it better than I could ever do. But it's how you navigate a set of circumstances where you know an authority that's duly constituted by God is erring. And at one point, Thomas More's children say, like, well, why didn't you just flaunt the authority of the king? And he says something very fascinating, but I really can't do it justice, Bo.
That's true. There's 15 seconds left. But I hope that what we've tried to do, of course, is not solve this issue, but to try to set the stage where maybe people can think about it better, which is not a matter of just like, always let your conscience be your guide, but to say, I'm trying to take the truths that we know are the case and apply them practically. And Godspeed with all of that, people. It's not easy work. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our family, city, state, nation, world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week. But in good conscience, tell the people how they should pray if they would like to do so with us.
We invite you to join us in our daily rhythm of prayer. We pray the Rosary on air at 5:30 a.m., 9:30 a.m., and 9:30 p.m. The Rosary is also always available on the Iowa Catholic Radio app. We have a couple other opportunities. The Angelus is prayed on air at 6 in the morning, and the Divine Mercy Chaplet every day at 3 p.m.
Yeah, folks, I want to tell you that we're very proud and happy of all that you guys were willing to do for us in Carathon. Jimmy, do we have like official yay statements we're supposed to say? Way to go, sluggers. Will you give us more money, right? Of course.
Do you have like a button that plays applause?
Not that he has that. Okay.
Sorry.
Well, Bud, here we go. I'm sure that made all of you go, that was worth it. No, we do want to very earnestly say thank you so much. Yeah!
I knew he had it at him.
I knew it. We want to thank everybody, though, really and truly, for giving all that they did during Carathon. You can still give if you made a pledge and you want to up the pledge. Make sure to go good on the pledge, all these things like that. IowaCatholicRadio.com. There's a donate button. You can do that on the Iowa Catholic Radio app or text or call 515-223-1150. This is our ministry together, not just the people on air, not just the people behind the boards or the people in the office. This is all of us together. We love being a part of this ministry with you. And, of course, we thank you for all that you were able and willing to give during the donation for Carathon, but we also really ask for your prayers, and we love our volunteers. It's been it's heartening every time to see people take time and energy and effort and their resources during Carathon to make our station work, and we really want to say thank you for doing so.
This can be a good reminder to sign up for our newsletter, because Bell Chase over the newsletter shared a really cool testimony from the Carathon. So if someone wants to hit us up on the ZipWhip line, I can forward that. But like you said, connect through social media or through our email newsletters. Great way to stay up with some of these really powerful testimonies of what God's doing through Iowa Catholic Radio.
Thank you all again, folks. It's The Uncommon Good, and we will be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.